Welcome to the Concordia University Wargame Design Speaker Series, which is funded by the SDS, the Strategic and Diplomatic Society of Concordia University's PSSA, the Political Science Students Association. Today, I'm very happy to have Brianna Proceviat from the Canadian Warfare Center to give us a presentation on her experience in design and application of warfare and non-warfare simulations in the Canadian Armed Forces. Brianna Proceviat holds a BA in political science from McGill University and has been a wargame designer and analyst for the Canadian Joint Warfare Center since 2020. In that capacity, she's designed and run multiple games for the Canadian Armed Forces. She previously worked as a research and game designer for lessons learned simulations and training and Imaginetic. So we will begin with Brianna sharing with us essentially how professional wargaming is done with the Canadian Armed Forces. So welcome, Brianna.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor. So as you mentioned, my name is Brianna Proceviat, and I'm here to talk to you about professional military wargaming, some of the work that we've done in the past couple of years within the CAF, as well as our best practices and some of the major considerations we take into wargame design. So I'm a part of the Canadian Joint Warfare Center. The Canadian Joint Warfare Center, or CJWC, which I'll refer to it, is a small unit under CJOC. For those of you unfamiliar with the structure of the Canadian Armed Forces, CJOC you can kind of think of as the headquarters, which all of the different services, Navy, Army, Air Force, and the other domains fall under, and they're in charge of the domestic and expeditionary operations. Our core mission is to lead the targeting, modeling, and simulation, organizational knowledge, and capability development experiences of the CAF to prepare joint forces for various operations. Put simply, you can think of us as a small think tank with practical implications for the CAF operating at a joint operational level. Over the past couple of years, we've been fortunate enough to develop some really important games for the CAF. Some of what I'll talk about today is the game we developed for Op Laser Not Vector, so the CAF assistance during the pandemic and the vaccine rollout. Our Submarine search and rescue game, which we did in 2020. Vigilant Shield, which I recently designed and ran for Defense of North America exercise. Force 2025, which is a project within a larger project for the potential reorganization of the Canadian Army's structure, and a strategic joint policy wargame, which we've developed for National Security Advisors course. So, why wargame? I could spend the entire 90-minute session on why we should wargame, why everybody should wargame, not just within the military, but also within university settings, within business settings. It's an incredibly valuable tool. However, I will not take up all that time, especially given I do currently co-instruct a course dedicated on the utility of wargaming and its appropriate uses within the CAF for a whole week. So I'm not going to try to fit that into one Zoom presentation. But a good way to think about why you want a wargame is related to its definition. So while there's no commonly accepted definition, we often like to use Peter Perla, one of the foremost wargame designers in the world. His definition, which is a wargame model or simulation whose operation does not involve the activities of actual military forces and whose sequence of events affects and is in turn affected by the decisions made by the players representing opposite sides. So, given that, the two major takeaways is that it's humans making decisions in a conflict scenario and setting. Now, the question here is why use wargames and why use humans and players simulating and abstracting and playing a game over, say, a computer simulation or a simulator or an exercise with actual forces running around the woods with weapons. And the reason for that is that wargames are an exercise in human decision-making and human behavior. And that in itself is where the value comes from, because humans are, in a lot of ways, the center of our universe. We're not the center of the universe, but in every sort of situation, humans are the confounding variable. And There's a common saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. I would like to modify that statement and say no plan survives contact with reality, particularly when humans are involved. And so war games are the best way to sort of figure out or to examine, determine what you might want to know, what you don't know, and certain strategies related to any plan or situation context. It provides understanding, particularly on the human component of a given problem. Again, I won't get too much detail, but basically, if you look at the left slide, so this is a slide that we delivered during our wargaming course. There are a lot of different utilities for wargaming and where they're appropriate. Some of the games that we're going to talk about fall under these categories, whether it be education and training, whether it be developing and testing plans, trialing new ideas, research and analytics. What they are bad for is calculating outcomes. Playing a war game is not going to prove to you whether or not you're going to win the war, nor will it give you exact data and exact outputs. We're going to talk about best practices throughout this session, and a lot of best practices will tell you that a lot of theories, a lot of scientific and technical data should underpin your war game and its development, but it's not going to produce that for you. You might have, for instance, the burn rates of a CF-18 into a war game, but it's not going to produce that for you. So what are the sorts of games? What does it look like in the day of the life of a professional war game designer such as myself? I'm going to walk you through. I recently designed and ran a game for CJWC related to Vigilant Shield. Vigilant Shield is an annual NORAD US Northcom Canadian joint exercise focused on continental defense and security missions related to North America. We developed this game and ran this game for over 20 participants, and those participants then made up full headquarters. So we developed quite a large game in which people were playing their role as they would in real life. And while I can't get too much into the details of the game and its takeaways, I can tell you what the game was intended to demonstrate. So mainly the considerations and implications related to operating in the Canadian North. The Arctic, for those of you who don't know, is very cold and is very vast. Canada is one of the largest countries in the world. And how do you go over land mass in extreme conditions when there isn't a lot of infrastructure there? As most Canadians know, we tend to live closer to the south of the border, closer to the US. So going back and forth, going across the Canadian Arctic is a major feat in itself. Excuse me, I'm going to use a lot of acronyms. I'm going to try to break them down for you as well. The other thing the game is intended to demonstrate is multi-domain awareness, so situational awareness, what is going on, and indicators and warnings of something happening. So that means that from your different elements, whether it be Navy, air, space, cyber, or land, you want to be able to receive and know what's going on all the different spectrums at all times, if possible, in order to receive as much warning that something is occurring. And so what are your capabilities in order to achieve that? Next, we also have the sustainment of forces operating in the Arctic in order to prevent burdening local populations of North. So as we mentioned, the majority of Canadians tend to live in the south of the Canadian territory. So how do we ensure that the squadrons or forces or elements operating up in the north have what they need, but we're not actually infringing on any of the Indigenous populations or other communities that live up there? And then finally, how do we coordinate with other partners in the region? And that can be domestically, but that can also be within US and Canadian relations, but also Arctic, within Arctic Circle members and parties. So with these in mind and what the game was intended to demonstrate, I'll walk you through some of the design components of the game that I developed. So the first things first is a map, and you'll notice that it's a little bit different from the one previous, which was our final. Any wargame designer will tell you that you will go through multiple iterations of the same game. and that the design process can be most likened to throwing spaghetti at the wall, because you're just trying to see what works, and it's only through multiple play tests. You know, we mentioned no plan survives contact with the enemy, and this time it's your client, it's players. And so you undergo a lot of redevelopment of all of your materials and your components. This is an unclassified, so some of the details are a little bit obscured in this, but the major components for you to look at here when trying to achieve the objectives that were set out are such. So you have some of the major Canadian bases up north, and there are different elements. So storage available, fuel capacities, radars, airfields, different infrastructure available. You'll notice there's the Canadian Air Defense Identification Zone, as well as the North Warning System and the radars and their ranges. You'll have the different logistic hubs located as well as supply lines, so ground supply lines, rail lines, etc. Also worth noting that these are 200 nautical mile hexes on the map, and that should tell you the Arctic is very vast, that Canada is very vast. Moving on to the game units or components. This was a multi-domain game, so we had elements from land, Air Force, Navy, and something you might not see in every other game, particularly if you're a hobbyist, are supplies. So for instance, aviation fuel, and from emerging domains. So emerging domains being space, cyber, the cognitive domain. So we might have something in this game like a cyber team. The bread and butter of the game, though, this game aimed to incorporate or to look at operations ranging from strategic, operational to tactical. So for explanation or your essay, tactical games will probably look at singular vehicles or platoon level. Operational, so while we are an operational level unit, and that's typically what we look at, which would be more the company or battalion level, we will also look as far as strategic, which might look at brigade level or whole of government approaches. So it's just something to consider, is that your spectrum of operations vary. And this game, while there was a lot of operational pieces and components and some tactical components, the cream of the game, the magic of the game, was its ability to illustrate some of the more strategic activities that are required to take place in order to successfully conduct operations in the Canadian Arctic. So breaking down, this was an action card that was used to frame the game, and it achieved two things. It allowed players to organize their activities so they can orient themselves, but it also acted as a form of data capture. And I'm sure we're going to talk about wargame analysis in some of the Q&A portion of this. But having mechanisms like these where you're able to record player actions is very helpful to the players, so they know what they need to record, what they need to show, but it also helps for someone who's doing this professionally and not just playing a game to be able to revisit the sorts of activities that were taking place. So the type of actions that you might have seen in this game, and I'll walk you through it, are things like contracting air. So this player might have been describing, okay, I'm going to use this capability with this budget, using these mechanisms to procure contracts for this purpose. So this might be contracting supplies to Iqaluit, and I will talk more about this, but they had to determine whether or not this is a minor, moderate, or maximum effort, how much time it would take to contract air, for instance. Was this a persistent or ongoing effect? So in this case, yes, they would probably contract for say 6 months, 8 months, however long the mission was taking place. What did this action aim to achieve? So what was its target? Was it to improve readiness? Was it to improve defense? Was it to improve the sustainment of the Canadian forces operating up north? Was it to improve information acquisition in that area of operation or other? And how did it relate to the con plan? Because this game was a lot about trying to improve and refine our contingency plans when operating in the Arctic. So everything had to be related to a particular purpose. They couldn't just do things because they wanted to. It had to be related to actual operations and how we plan to formalize operations in the Canadian Arctic. Other things that they could have done in the game is transmit orders. That might be something that's more of a minor effort, or to stand up a team to produce active and passive countermeasures in, say, the IM, information management sphere. So looking at defensive counter cyber sort of operations. How this works, so we have the actions, and then to adjudicate them, because every game requires rules, it requires to adjudicate, as everybody on this call knows. So how do we do that? Essentially, as I mentioned, they had to determine whether or not it was a minor, moderate, or major effort. They were given specific numbers per scenario, and this was to illustrate the capacity of that particular headquarters in resources, manpower, time, energy, etc. So this was an abstraction that I made and that I created in order to say that you were limited in how many actions you could perform within a particular time span within this scenario and within this context. So for example, they could have received 5 minor actions to play with, 3 moderate, and 1 major. And that meant that they had to prioritize all of their activities. So were they going to focus on forward logistics for a lot of their operating areas up north? Were they going to focus on force protection? Or were they going to focus on procuring supplies or increasing the notice to move of all of their assets and all of their units that might be deploying? It forced them to sort of figure out what was the most important part of their plan and what needed to work. And part of the way this was structured is it was not only meant to make them make those hard decisions, but also it determined the breadth and the chance of success that each action had. So something like sending out orders was a minor, it might be a sure thing, but something like reinforcing a base would probably have to be a moderate or a major effort given our capabilities. And as such, this was to adjudicate how well, how successfully, and how many bases, for instance, could be reinforced. So what it looked like during this game and during the adjudication process is basically taking these cards and player actions and using subject matter expertise in order to determine the results. So whether that meant increasing or allowing them to deploy a reserve unit in order to provide assistance in the game, whether that meant they were able to fortify a base or infrastructure and by how much, whether or not, and this is because we also had competitors present in the game, whether or not protests occurred. Sometimes things backfired. Sometimes red actions may have elicited either through information operations or different sorts of campaigns, organized protests, which they then had to deal with the fallout of such. And similarly, delays. So delays in procuring supplies, delays in sending supplies, and all of those were related into the game. The product or the value of which was, well, how do we deal with that fallout? So if these are reasonable things that could happen, such as delays in procuring supplies, we saw that during the pandemic. Well, how do we mitigate that fallout? What can we change in terms of our standard operating procedures so that this doesn't happen in the future? And what can we do to mitigate its effect now? And these are kind of the questions, and that's why war games are such a valuable tool, is that it's great to have a plan. The plan almost always never works, or at least it doesn't work as you think it is. And when you're in a war game, you actually have to deal with the consequences of your plan not working. And that's what forces you to think, okay, I don't want this to happen again. So there's the evocative factor of, I just failed. And I'm lucky that I failed in a game where losing a CF-18 means that I've bruised my ego and haven't lost lives, haven't lost millions of dollars. Or what can I do to prevent this from happening? And what can I do to mitigate any of this fallout in the future? So having public relations on standby, having redundancy built into our plan, that sort of thing. is what games like these are intended to demonstrate and to tease out. And then ideally, and we'll talk more about this in the Q&A, but you run a war game as I did. So Vigilant Shield, you have 20 people in the room playing this game over the span of days, and you come out with a bunch of outcomes in terms of these are activities, these are actions that were performed. There's a narrative that started from start to finish. Operations took place, and then you not only record what happened, but the so what factor. And the so what factor is incredibly important because war games are a lot like Vegas. You know, it's great, everybody's having a lot of fun, but you don't want them to be Vegas. You want things to actually be implemented. There are three main tenets when you are doing professional war games, and that's that your results should be analyzed and all of your analysis should be accessible. So people should be able to read the results, they should be able to see it. For it to be widely disseminated, you have the most impact. You would be surprised by the amount of people who have a stake in things working out. And so having reports such as these and having more stakeholders involved and invested in the outcomes of your war games means that some of the practical implications and recommendations that were derived from the war game might actually come to fruition. So that's important. So accessible, auditable. You know, war games are not experiments, war games are games, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't lend scientific rigor to the process of analyzing them and their outcomes. You might have certain takeaways that are more due to the game or gameisms or the lack of realism in your scenario rather than what is true in reality. So being able to make those determinations and be able to objectively look at the game that you've developed and run. So auditable, accessible, and I can't remember the third one. That's bad. Accurate is the third one. So it's very similar to, they all sort of blend together, but essentially accuracy is the third tenet of good war game analysis. And you want to ensure that all of the rigor that's been lent to the game, that all of the data that's gone into the game and all of the data that's come out of the game are as accurate as possible. The key to this is not only building and designing a war game with a lot of research behind it, but also having players who are playing the game which are subject matter experts. And this is important because having players who are unfamiliar with the role that they are playing, it could be great. They could have some great ideas, but if they're not familiar with the realities of the role, if they're not familiar with the constraints in which that particular organization is operating under, or what it actually looks like on the ground to be that person, a lot of their ideas lack the credibility necessary and might not be very legitimate when you actually take a second look at it. And as such, you want to ensure that you have the right players so that you get the most buy-in as possible, you get the most realistic results, and therefore all the work that you've done in the war game, people agree with and buy into. And that's something that is really important because a lot of work goes into war games, and you want people to walk away with it not being, oh, that was fun, but being, wow, okay, if we don't do something about that, we're going to be really hurt. And we want to be able to mitigate these effects or these challenges as much as possible. So here are the solutions that we found and were brought out by the war game. And that's kind of why you play a war game, is to fail and then come back with lessons about why we failed, how we failed, and what we can do better. Professional wargaming considerations. So a lot of you on this session are hobby wargamers, or you've played games for fun, and that's great. And a lot of them are very accurate, and a lot of them can actually be the jumping off point for what we use in the professional field. Because a lot of game mechanics, one of the best ways to become a professional wargame designer is to play a lot of games in order to familiar yourself with the broad spectrum and the innovative ideas of ways to represent things and to play things out and to model things. But that being said, there are certain considerations we might take into account more so than a game that you would find on the shelf at your local gaming store. And that would be the 4 C's. So communication, coordination, command and control. Under that being, especially as well, how do you communicate, coordinate, how does C2 work in coalition warfare, particularly for Canada? We're almost never engaging in operation alone. We're almost always as a part of a NATO alliance or some other Five Eyes organization. And then how do you coordinate or communicate across domains as well? So we at CJWC are the joint entity within the CAF. That's really important part, which I'll get to as well, is that multi-domain is important because war is hardly ever fought by one particular service. It's fought across all, but how do you link those in and how do you link those together during a game? How do you balance them? Particularly as they move in different rates, move across different times, distances, get into that. Logistics. So logistics is very important. We have a saying in the wargaming community that any game without logistics should only be played for entertainment. And that's because it's often the unglamorous things such as logistics, such as command and control, such as resources, which is what wins you the war or loses you the war. And we're seeing that a lot right now in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is that when you don't consider the unglamorous components of war, such as logistics, that's when you're going to be stuck in the mud. So it's really important on a professional level to think about logistics, but also Canada. We're very far removed from a lot of areas of the world, particularly a lot of the hot areas of the world. So another thing that we need to consider is, okay, how do we enter and exit theater? So the area in which the conflict is taking place or the area in which we're sending and deploying force elements, and how do we sustain them, knowing that Canada might be far removed from the actual conflict?
Yeah, virtually all of the failed predictions of the conduct of the early part of the war in Ukraine were based on a failure to appreciate the impact of logistics.
Exactly. And so I actually have a little further down a picture of the convoy because nobody wants to think about logistics. It's a lot of people thinking it's just counting beans and potatoes and bullets. But that's a very important part of any war plan. And when you fail to do that, you end up being stuck in the mud, quite literally, or having your soldiers deserting because they're freezing during the winter in Eastern Europe. So something to consider. And then, as I mentioned, especially for Canada, where we are not close to Europe, we're not close to a lot of areas where we might be sending force elements. How do you keep your troops sustained? How do you get them there, knowing that they might be particularly vulnerable when traversing certain passages within the world? So that's a major consideration for us whenever we're running a game. It's something that not everybody likes to do because it's not as fun as shooting bullets, but counting those bullets are incredibly important to make sure that you can shoot. So logistics is very important. And then very similar and leading into that is resource management. So how do you manage scarcity in particular? You might have a certain amount of assets, doesn't mean that you actually have all of those assets. So how do you contend with that? How do you manage that? When you see a lot of games or hobby games, you might have the whole of the German army available to you. But if you actually consider in the operations, or if we're looking at a World War II scenario setting, they were fighting a war on 4 fronts with different force elements deployed all over. So how do you manage the fact that you might not actually have everything that you think you have in your wheelhouse? And how do you contend with that? That's a major part of any war plan. And so it's a major part of what we do is managing finite resources. Particularly, we like to think that we have all the money in the world. We don't. So that's another consideration as well, as just war costs money. And so you think you might want to use up everything in your arsenal, but we might not have the funds or the capacity to produce more. So these are other things to consider. Another thing is human element. I come from political science. background with minor in sociology, so I find the human element is something that's often forgotten, but is incredibly important when you're examining war, particularly, you know, what keeps wars going, or how can, and going back to Ukraine and Russia, how can a seemingly asymmetric conflict where you have the big baddie who outnumbers and perhaps has more technology and overall objectively or was decided to have a better or superior force, how have they not overtaken Ukraine and the Ukrainians? And a lot of that can be linked to the human element. Not to say that that is the be all and end all, and we'll get into that. There are two sides of this conflict where either people forget it, or they think that if you have the heart, if you fight like tigers, you're suddenly going to overcome your adversary, the David and Goliath story. That's also not exactly true. So how do you find your way into the middle where you're able to model the importance of the human element without underestimating or overestimating it? And then finally, something that would be different in the professional setting than maybe a hobby setting is looking at timescales of different games and ending the game. So how do you end the game in a professional game? You might not necessarily have the time, or you have different time spans in mind. And then, you know, what does winning the war look like? What does winning the game look like? And I'll talk about that. So moving on, do we have any questions before I continue? I don't know if you want to jump in here.
Well, I think I have a great many questions, and I see we have some new viewers, but I'm going to hold them until the end. That's okay.
All right, perfect. Okay, so C4ISR, I'm going to get into that and explain for those of you who don't know. I do not have a military background. I came in from McGill, political science, and I'll walk you through my first day where my coworker asked me what my thoughts were on the problem statement related to C4ISR and how we think we could abstract BDA in this game. And I was a deer in headlights. I had no idea what any of that meant. I had never heard those strings of letters and numbers put together in one sentence. I have learned. And so we've developed quite a few things on command and control because it is a hot button topic. But for those of you in the audience who might not be familiar with it, command and control is essentially the system or the structure that really gives people the authorities to exercise command and it is what it says it is, to control its forces. So your headquarters, your leader of the army, the systems which empower it to do so, how they talk to each other, that sort of thing. So this is a very important part of any operation, but it's one that's often neglected, and it's one that most militaries across the world, if not all militaries, are trying to contend with. How do they perfect it? Because that can be the difference in minutes for being able to do something. We're seeing, I keep bringing back, but current affairs is a great, or real examples is a great way to elicit understanding. We can compare the command and control of the Ukrainians versus the command and control of the Russians, where I think at least in the first 3 months of the invasion or incursion into Ukraine, Russia lost something ridiculous like 16 generals. And that really demonstrates, maybe they need to improve some of their command and control systems and procedures. Why did they have such important leadership so close to the front lines, but also what was the fallout from losing those leaders? And did their forces know what to do after losing their generals? That's something that we saw where, no, there wasn't really a clear commander's intent, which was given. And part of the reason that we saw the Russian forces flounder to the extent that they did is the lack of leadership, the lack of command and control, the fact that a lot of their systems didn't seem to work as well, and the fact that they weren't communicating as well as they probably could be. So it's a very important part, but it's a weird thing to integrate into a game that you're playing, because in a game setting where you usually have all of the same players in the room, either split into two different rooms if you're doing a double-blind game. So a double-blind game is essentially a game where you might have 2 or 3 maps. So you have a map for the blue team being own or friendly forces, a map for the red team, usually being the opponent's or adversary's forces. And then you might have another map for the white cells. So those would be your adjudicators or your game masters, whatever you want to call them, basically what I do. And that map would have absolutely everything that's going on. So perfect situational awareness. All of the pieces that currently exist in the reality of the game are displayed on that map. The blue side would have maybe varying degrees. They would know where their forces are, probably. And they might know where some of the red forces are. Likewise, the same thing for red, where they might know where all of or their forces are. That's not always a given. And then they would maybe know where some blue forces are, depending on their capacity for ISR, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So it's basically your ability to sense the opposing forces or the opposing side. And so basically there are different ways to integrate that, but it's a very weird thing because when you're all together in a room, you can just talk to each other. You can just look over at the map. So what are the things that we do? How do we consider command and control, which is such a key part of war, and that's which is a huge detriment to a lot of people operating even in peace. So what do we do to integrate that? And so there's a couple of things. So making sure that they don't have perfect situational awareness is a big one. So determining what they would realistically know in real life versus what's actually true. So that's why your blue side and your red side might not have all of their pieces on the board. They might not know where the other pieces are from the opposing force, but they might also have lost one of their own units. So that's something that might happen in the game. More realistically, though, it's things like line of sight communication. So can you communicate to people in the game or other players? And that might be, well, do you have the technology to? Do you have the system to? Are you in line of sight? So can you talk directly? Or we might, play a game of telephone or the not politically correct term Chinese whispers, where a lot of it is maybe degraded or you're hearing wrong information. And so this is what can make playing war games, particularly in the professional setting, really engaging, is that while we're integrating these really important, really complex and very serious and sort of dry elements of conducting military operations, you can make it really engaging with the ways that you're able to simulate that. And so going back to something you would have played in kindergarten even, such as a game of telephone, while we might not have our players do that exactly, but passing notes and seeing those notes maybe get damaged or delayed is some of the ways in which we're able to illustrate that, which can be really cool. So working as a war game designer really allows you to revisit your childhood and be able to play, but also to be creative and be innovative, which is a really cool aspect of the job. Moving on from just command and control generally, there's different elements that we have to consider as well, which is, as I mentioned, how do you consider, how do you balance coordinating effects from the different services? So, Air Force, Navy, et cetera, which operate at different scales, rates, times, distances. So a frigate would take a lot longer to traverse the Indian Ocean than an aircraft would. So how do you account for that in the same game when things move at different times? The time it takes, the distances it takes, its capacity to do so. Can they talk to each other? So these are things to do. You might find in a game that's being played for entertainment where you're able to call in the Air Force just like that from the ground. That's not always the case. And they might also have other areas of the operating environment. So this is part of resource management, but they might not always be available to that particular mission set. So some of the things that we have to configure into our war games is okay, well, how would these relate to each other in this particular setting? And then the same thing is across countries. So as I mentioned, Canada almost always operates in the context of a coalition. And so how does that influence our command and control structure? Particularly if you're looking at different countries, which might have different rules of engagement, they might have a different culture, they might have different supplies and logistics. So how do you account for that? Because I think we assume that all NATO countries might be able to work perfectly together, or that if there's ever an axis of evil, as there was in World War II, that they would work perfectly together, but that seldom happens. And it's very dangerous to just assume that because you're on the same side, that you'll be able to just tell, your ally, oh, can you do this, or that sort of thing. So integrating a lot of international relations into the context of military operations is important as well, because you need to account for the fact that things aren't always perfect in the realm of communication, as we know, and coordination. If we can't do it interpersonally, which we often find, country to country is even more difficult. So that's one of the considerations for a professional wargame designer. Another one, or another way that we've illustrated that, is our Submarine search and rescue game. So it's really important when we were releasing them back into the oceans for different missions to ensure that our forces, which were deployed on them for months at a time, would be safe. And if something were to go wrong, that they wouldn't be stranded at the bottom of the ocean. So we wargamed that search and rescue operation in both a domestic environment, but also expeditionary environment. And here, communication, coordination, command and control is incredibly important because the key is time. The longer it takes to rescue, the less chance you actually have to be able to rescue the people on board. So one of the ways that we were able to illustrate that is through a communications grid. And that's why something as simple as using an Excel spreadsheet, which is what I did, was how we were able to illustrate that. And so you'll notice there are different colored boxes. Those are to represent functions. The blue ones are to illustrate the fact that many of these entities were co-located, but really it was about talking to each other. So really what you'll notice is numbers, and the numbers will tell you what day they were notified and at what hour, because that was really important. Where the submarine search and rescue, you're looking at minutes, you're looking at hours in order to rescue the people on board, unlike some other operations. So time was an imperative here, and making sure that the people that needed to be notified, that needed to be mustered, were notified as soon as possible and alerted as soon as possible. So anybody that was highlighted in this grid was then able to act, because they would have reasonably known what was going on at the time, because somebody had notified them or they had been co-located. And what that looked like in the game, this is kind of blurry, but this particular game was an exercise in command and control in itself, just because we played this game with, I think, 60 participants over 3 different locations. So Halifax, Ottawa, and Esquimalt. And we had our participants chime in over VTC, and computers and technologies aren't your friend. So it was a very interesting way to play the game, but we were able to input it digitally and show what the last known position of the submarine was, and show what entities were being mustered, where they were, when things were being deployed, that sort of thing, when what phase of the operation we were in. So that was a very cool way to do that, but it really does show that there's so many different mechanisms and ways that you can show. It's just related to what your objective is. So something like this, where we needed to look at things to the minute, looking at who's talking to each other, and when they know or are aware of certain things, and what those communication links are, is incredibly important. Something like a domestic operation, like a vaccine rollout, it might be less important, because maybe time isn't as an imperative, or perhaps a lot of those communication structures already exist. something that's maybe less common, such as the submarine search and rescue operation. It's an exercise also just in the fact that because it doesn't occur every day, because you're standing up organizations which aren't often stood up, it's important to get that right and to rehearse that in a game rather than trying to do so in real life. And so that's why you might want to integrate something like communication in a game like this versus maybe less so in another operation. So anything that you're looking at integrating, really you can relate it back to the objectives of the ultimate game. Yeah, logistics. So pretty sure you can figure out where that's from. So this is the convoy that they just started picking off in Ukraine. And really, the war in Ukraine over the past year really demonstrates some of the things that I think all countries have to think about. Because we've been in peace for so long, or we've been in different types of operations, that I think that every country has gotten perhaps a little bit behind or lagged in terms of where they think that they are. And it's important for militaries to always be innovating and progressing in how they are able to conduct operations and being very cognizant on what their plan is, but rehearsing that plan, what are the points of failure, and not being, I think, complacent and we've done this before, we know about it, it's boring, let's test some weapons instead. It's great to have the newest weapons, but that's seldom what's going to win you the war. It's going to be having the supplies necessary. It's going to be having the bullets for those weapons available to you when you need it. And so logistics is a major component of what we do. And there are different ways in which you can address it or integrate it. I came up with a very basic system, which is actually loosely inspired by some commercial games, but it basically takes your different classes of supply that you would find in the military and uses a point-to-point map. So I won't use a particular example because that would be more classified, but I can show you that you might have area of operation in which you have the major hubs or where you have your units currently located. And you can use a point-to-point, which illustrates both distance, but also time that it would take. So the one that I developed, it's factoring in the ability to travel by road for 24 hours. And what are some of the ground or terrain obstacles in the way? So the links would be anything that can be traveled by road, or what could be traveled by sea, and you could draw on air links. And how it worked was basically you had this sort of map, and then you had available actions. So this was a very simple system that we can use, and we can opt out for different war games, and we can either increase its fidelity, so increase its accuracy, or we can keep it as is. So this is a very basic one to employ for most war games so that we're not forgetting them, but it's a very simple way to factor in logistics. And so your available actions in this sort of game would be to move supply, to take supply, to relocate any of your assets, whether that be equipment, supply itself, and to play a card in refill hand. These cards would be scenario or AO specific, but that might be something like increasing your force protection for a convoy. That might be something like increasing or reinforcing your logistics infrastructure, particularly its IT system, for example, or it could be doing reconnaissance for certain routes. Again, this is very specific, but these are things that you want to be thinking about and are often forgotten when you're planning the overall operation. So just bringing it back to what are the make or breaks of operations? And so factoring those in, we use cards often because those are very simple and those can be added, those can be edited the day of. Another thing to note, so you had a point-to-point map, you had your different classes of supplies, and you had your different available actions, and you were given time constraints in the sequence of play. So you couldn't move everything at once, but you also couldn't move everything on one thing at once either. So a lot of what we like to do is looking at, okay, well, what sort of transportation type are you using? Are you using something like air? Are you using a convoy of trucks? You might be using AOPV or a naval frigate. And what number of these transportation assets you have available to you, because this is where people often think, oh, I'm gonna move all these supplies all here in the next couple of weeks. Well, do you have enough aircraft that have the capacity to bring those supplies or that equipment to the location? So these are things to consider that people often forget because, again, it's not glamorous to think about. They want to be thinking about missiles and different sort of force ratios. But again, a lot of your make or break is, well, can you get people into theater? Can you get your equipment into theater? Can you get your supplies into theater? And if I did mention, theater is the operating area. And then other things to factor in is just special rules. So for instance, looking at this game is really great at, well, what are the trade-offs with using different transportation types? So aircraft is great because you can fly anywhere pretty much within the time span, as long as there's suitable airfields. So can they handle the aircraft? And this is because not all airstrips can support larger, heavier aircraft, so that's something to consider. But for the most part, aircrafts are great because they can fly many things to many places in a short period of time. But that being said, they might not necessarily have the same capacity in terms of payloads, or they might be more vulnerable in the air. So these are certain things that we consider, and this is what the game brings out, is that trucks can be really great for a constant flow of supplies and sustainment. There are certain things that are just safer to be potentially commuted by trucks or by ground rather than by air, one of them being fuel. And then same thing with, using something like a naval transportation asset. Well, do you have a port available? That sort of thing. So these are the sorts of games that we do, is that really any game should be bringing out what decision makers need to know, and it should be helping decision makers. And what's great about games like these is you can play them multiple times. So, maybe for this game, you've been using a lot of your air assets. Well, what would it look like if I used more ground assets? And that sort of thing is that playing war games professionally, particularly very simple game systems such as this one, allows you to play them multiple times, and it allows you to come away with different things. That being said, just because the game is simple doesn't mean that it has to come up with simple solutions or simple outcomes and takeaways. One of the things that we like to integrate as a best practice whenever we're playing a game is that we have things called challenge cards. And this is to mitigate the fact that, as I mentioned, games will sometimes have things that are maybe not as realistic because they are abstractions. By their very nature, you're trying to model something that's very complex and that's in reality, in real life, and trying to find a way to simplify it and to allow it to be playable, usually within the periods of hours or a day. And given that, you're going to have to take away a lot of details. You're going to have to strip fidelity. To compensate for that, we have systems such as the bullshit or the challenge cards, as we like to call them, which basically allow players to decry any sort of magic wand waving. So anytime, one thing you're not considering is the fact that this road is not usable during this time of the year. It would also consider the fact that perhaps that particular airfield isn't C-17 capable, for instance. These are the things that the cards would challenge. So it might challenge aspects of the game, but it also challenged things that the players themselves have done. This allows us to come up with a way to look at all of the outcomes and to write out, so we have the most accurate results, what are the outliers or what are the things that aren't realistic. The way we sort of deal with that as well can be really interesting, where for one of the games that we did, I conducted a thematic analysis of all of our challenge cards. And you're basically from first glance able to see what some of the issues with, not with the game, but with the what we were gaming itself. So this was for, I won't go into details, but it was for a contingency plan. And one of the things that we noticed was that throughout this plan, there was a lot of missing unclear instructions, which inhibited the C2 structure and processes, a lot of just ineffective methods of ways people were doing things, missing capability. So for logistics, this is really important where, for instance, they didn't have the heavy equipment transporter necessary to achieve what they were trying to do. And another one is just failure to pass information, came up a lot as well. And so you're playing a game and you're noticing that there are certain trade-offs, and you're noticing we're conducting logistics of supplies, but we're running into a lot of barriers and roadblocks. And these are the challenges that are brought forth. And then you're able to come away with, okay, well, what are the major areas, or what are the themes of what went wrong in the game? And you're able to come away with that and then be able to come up with a series of recommendations for what you can do better. So looking at, okay, well, in my contingency plan, how can I rewrite it, or how can I come up with a list of more cohesive and comprehensive instructions and communications so that all of the entities or all of the subordinates know what they're supposed to do and are able to do so correctly and appropriately. So these are the sorts of things that we contend with, where you might have maybe a very simple game such as this one, dealing with logistics, but then you find mechanisms in which you can increase the fidelity without limiting the playability of the game, and without making it Settlers of Catan, where you have to read a whole booklet of rules. Another thing, as I mentioned, resource management. So very similar to logistics, but not necessarily the same. And that's because every organization in the world has to contend with the fact that they only have so many resources. And this is something that everybody needs to improve in terms of how do you manage scarcity, because that can be the killer, is not knowing how to prioritize what you do have available, and knowing what you have available in the first place and doing that inventory. So a lot of the war games that we do is the acknowledgement that while you might have an order of battle that tells you that you have, 5 of this, 6 of this, 7 of this, you might not have all of those working. Some might be in maintenance, some might be broken down, some might be out of commission, but you also might have some of those deployed elsewhere on other missions. So how do you deal with the fact that you don't always have everything available to you? And so one of the games which we developed this year, which really articulates that, is related to the project, as I mentioned, Force 2025, which is about the potential restructuring and some of the potential ideas for how best to restructure the Canadian Army. So it's often in the news that we are short in terms of recruitment, and yet the demands on the CAF and in terms of having to meet certain mission sets are static, if not increasing. So how do we contend with the fact that we are trying to meet a bunch of requirements in which we are trying to deploy and force generate forces to succeed these missions with a depleting force? And this is something that most militaries around the world are struggling to contend with right now. So how do we use the assets that we have in order to whack as many moles as best and as fast as we possibly can, is really what this game is about. So generating insights into these capabilities and to stress the institution. So what I did was I took the Canadian Army structure, and then I went through multiple iterations where we changed the layout of the Canadian Army to reflect the ideas that were proposed. I won't get too much into that, but basically you can look at the difference. So you have platoons, you have companies, you have battalions, and what our participants or what our players were asked to do were to then take that structure and to try to meet the different requirements for different operations. So whether that's continuing with exercises and with training in schools, whether that's meeting something like Operation Impact in the Middle East or Operation Reassurance, And Operation Lentis, they would basically force generate and force employ, so meaning to produce that unit and then put that unit on the task, such as an Op Lentis. For those of you in the audience who might not be familiar, an Operation Lentis is essentially when the CAF goes out and fills sandbags in different provinces during a flooding. So not just flooding, but that's anything that's sort of a domestic natural disaster assistance to the provinces falls under Operation Lentis. And that's where we're usually force generating and employing for a couple of weeks or months members of the Canadian Army to assist the provincial governments. And so how can we continue to meet these domestic requirements while we might have, for instance, increasing requirements in Latvia? So can't really see the details of what exactly is in Latvia, but for those of you that read the news, we have an enhanced forward protection. So the EFP, which consists of several companies and such, of different elements across the Canadian military. And if those NATO requirements keep increasing, how are we able to meet those and to be able to meet and be a good NATO partner while also trying to contend with the fact that we have a lot of domestic operations at home and that we're trying to meet more of a global relevant picture of different operations abroad. So this game could be most likened to whack-a-mole. We're trying your best to force generate and to organize in a way that you are able to hit all the different mission sets with all of the right number of required units in the best way that they could. So war games don't always have to be war games where you're looking at one force shooting another force. You could also have something just as simple as, okay, well, how can we rearrange or reorganize an organization in a way that we can meet all of the different requirements and responsibilities that have been set out to us. Moving on, we also have the human element. So the human element, as I mentioned, is extremely important because it's humans fighting wars, because humans are often the confounding variable, which is often underanalyzed in most contexts, but which is mostly determinant of any sort of problem or situation. War games are an exercise in human behavior, and so war games are a great way to look at the human element, because when you're playing a war game, you get a true understanding and therefore empathy of the situation that you are playing. So this could not only be your role, as I mentioned, it's really important for people who are actually in the roles to be playing their roles. You know, if your job is, you know, commander of the Air Force, we ideally want the commander of the Air Force or somebody who has that sort of knowledge base to be able to speak to that role and to speak to the requirements of that role. But one of the other benefits of war games is being able to turn the map and allow people who might benefit from a perspective of what it looks like on the other side. So if we were playing a game set in the Middle East where it was the 2014 liberation of Mosul, and we're looking at the human element, you might have some of your players from the Canadian side also playing ISIS, or also playing perhaps some of the Sunni or local populations in some of the areas which were overtaken by ISIS. And it's sort of playing that role that allows you to gain perspective and that understanding of what the capabilities are, but also what the considerations are in that environment, in that situation, that context. And that builds empathy, which is important in order to understand how to beat your enemy, which sounds very cynical and kind of wrong, I suppose, but at the same time, it's, you know, understanding your enemy is the best way to know how to defeat your enemy. It's just the way war works, I think. So how do you depict the human element? There are different ways to do this. One of the games which I mentioned is we have developed a strategic power, that's what it's roughly called, game for one of our national security advisors courses. And how this game works, it's what's called a hybrid war game that's designed to educate players on strategic actions available to policymakers in a peacekeeping and a peace enforcement context, the limitations and implications of using military power, and the best uses of military power in a realistic civil and diplomatic crisis. What this means is we basically had a fictional country undergoing a fictional sort of war in which one country committed an incursion into another country, and we had displacements of people, we had terrorism, and we were basically looking at, okay, well, what are the options available to the host country, which is currently undergoing said invasion and said occupation, but also what are the options available to its allies. And this was across the spectrum. So this would be more of a strategic game, meaning that we were not only looking at the use of militaries, because you don't always want to deploy forces in contexts such as this, but how can we optimize our use of diplomacy, information, our economic power as well, to be able to sort of achieve the objectives of peace, which is what we're seeking. And how can we resolve this situation without perhaps shedding blood, was what this game seeks to achieve. And so the ways that we were able to abstract some of the more human elements related to this scenario was related to a spectrum. And the spectrum was really cool because not only could players influence it during the game through different actions, but where you sat in the spectrum related to the amount of resources you had in that field as well, but also overall. So certain countries such as Canada might have a higher diplomatic standing and therefore more resources at their disposal to play on the diplomatic sphere. And that this might mean working with the UN, this might be negotiating peace treaties, etc. Domestic opinion for the players that where it was relevant, but also even foreign countries. This is always a consideration where if you're getting involved in a foreign conflict or a foreign crisis situation, is there the political will? And particularly in democracies, political will is usually underpinned with how the population feels about this crisis at that given time. And so within this game, because we see this in real life, players were able to act on in either demote or promote domestic opinion within their own countries, but also within other countries, using the capabilities that they had available to them. And that domestic opinion is what allowed you to perform actions or to spend capital, either political capital or actual economics and money on this crisis in order to be involved in the crisis. So this that was a very interesting mechanism we used. And all of these factors as well were also influenced by two of the main tracks, which was the escalation track, but also the humanitarian aid track. So tracking the fallout and how, for instance, humanitarian aid and humanitarian crisis, particularly the number of refugees, influences all of the other tracks, such as diplomacy, such as domestic opinion, such as domestic security, especially, and how the further you escalate in a crisis, it will alter everybody's standing within a diplomatic, information, military, and economic context. So seeing how different human element factors in a conflict situation other than the military sort of flow together, and the confluence of those, and how whole of governments can work together in order to achieve more peaceful aims and policies within the framework of the international context. This is a really cool way to do that and to play that out. Another thing that we can talk about, and if you're interested for a longer take on this, my colleague David Redpath and I delivered a lecture for the Georgetown University Wargaming Society on morale in wargaming and how you can illustrate that. I'm going to talk just very, very briefly about the importance of morale, but as we've seen in history, but also in current day with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, morale does seem to have an effect. But morale is incredibly variable, and it can differ across nations, across domains, and across units. Not every regiment is necessarily going to have the same morale. Not every domain, whether it be the Air Force versus the Army, might have the same level of morale. And then culturally speaking, as we've seen, there might be different morale. So understanding those factors, but then how do you integrate that as well? Because even during a situation, things maintain but also erode morale. So for instance, we're seeing right now that the longer that the conflict drags on, the lower morale for both entities, both Ukraine and Russia, decrease, because the longer that you're involved in the conflict and the less it seems like you're winning, the harder things are, the more you're in a stalemate, naturally morale tends to erode. So how do you factor that into a game when it's such a potentially subjective, but also very variable factor that's not very well understood? So there's a lot of different ways that you can illustrate that and integrate that in the game, but it comes really to the effects and what you're trying to achieve and what you're looking at. So a very easy way to think about morale in war games and how you should integrate them is the effect on units, the effect on tactics and considerations, and the effect on resources. So in terms of units, morale, particularly individual or regiment, company, battalion morale, it acts as a heightened performance. So a very easy way to illustrate that is that they might have a higher defense or attack value than their opponent who has a lower morale, or it could be a force multiplier, which basically means that they might have more units available. Your force ratio might be higher. Another effect is, as I mentioned, tactics and considerations. So forcing a dime strategy, hearts and minds is a big one. Is if your population has a higher morale, there might be more attention devoted to it, and therefore you might have more capacity to maneuver or to perform certain strategies than you would if you have a lower morale, where your forces are potentially dragging their feet, your population doesn't really support you as much, and therefore you can't do anything that necessarily could result in, say, a public revolt. So these are things to keep in mind. And then finally, effects on resources, as we've seen. This is a very interesting debate and topic of conversation, but morale, population, but also worldwide. So we've noticed that Ukraine seems to have won the hearts and minds of the Western world, at least. And that's important because it increases and decreases the resources available to a specific fashion. So Western support to Ukraine has been incredibly important in what they've been able to achieve in the conflicts, given all the resources given to them, at least by the United States, but also by Germany, et cetera. So morale is something you want to illustrate because that can be the difference in their capability levels and what resources they have available to them. And as we mentioned, logistics, resources is incredibly important. And I think underestimating the support that Ukraine would have, particularly among Western nations, was a miscalculation by Russia, but also a miscalculation by the West generally. So these are things you want to consider when you're wargaming proactively rather than wargaming post a crisis or conflict. And then finally, one of the factors that is incredibly important for a professional wargame practitioner is when do you end the game, what the timescale is, and what does winning the game look like? And this is a conversation I have every time I run a game where people, participants always ask me, well, when are we ending? How many turns is it going to be? What's the timescale? And the answer to that is always, in my opinion, you should never tell them. I always say to be determined. And that's for two reasons. You want to play the game to the point where you actually derive enough information. So you don't really know how many turns that might take. It could take 2 turns, but more often than not, it's going to take several turns, and you can't really estimate how much you need to play in order to get as much information that's relevant as possible without overwhelming yourself. But secondly, there's no such thing as winning in real life. And there's a phenomenon called last turn madness, which often occurs when people know that the game is about to end, where that's usually when they start taking riskier or more radical actions. But worst of all, they spend everything in their arsenal. And the problem with that is that that's not very realistic, because life is never ending. Things keep going. So even after the war, there's consequences. Even after the battle, there's consequences. So in a war game, if you're looking at one particular mission, right, you might have won that mission, but if you had to use the entirety of the CAF's resources to do it, you've not won the war. And so that's something that we consider, is that unlike a lot of games that we play, we don't really have a lot of winners and losers, because there's no such thing. What does it mean to have won? And so for us, our major takeaway, or what we consider winning, is instead of you have red versus blue, where red shot more shots successfully, or blue took out more units, we actually look at, well, what were the three highlights? What were the major findings? And to us, that's what winning the game looks like, is how we found solutions to problems that we've been pulling our hair out over. And that's what winning the game looks like in a professional wartime scenario, rather than a point system. Any questions?
Yeah, absolutely fascinating presentation. I mean, I appreciate the fact that you anticipate a lot of my questions, and that you've shared with us philosophic insights that show that you're operating at the cutting edge, and also operating in the professional sphere where there are consequences and stakes, right? These are not, this is not hobby wargaming where people are replaying Napoleon. You've dealt with professionals who are actually trying to solve specific problems, not only in terms of the treasure of the taxpayers, but obviously the lives of Canadians and our allies. I'd like to bring it back to, I guess the institutional process, just to bring it to the first step. Your agency, obviously, I mean, realistically, it operates in a competitive institutional environment. Where does the tasking begin? I mean, who do you get requests from different organizations within the Canadian Forces, or do you have an authority that assigns you a task? How does that process work?
We do. No, that's a very good question. So wargaming within the CAF, the way we do it and our organization is fairly nascent. So the team was only really stood up and formalized a couple of years ago. So we find ourselves seeking clients a lot of the time, but we've also been very successful in our ability to raise awareness, to the point where we receive a lot of requests and we can't actually necessarily perform them all, or at least not immediately. So we find ourselves prioritizing them a lot, and it's our chain of command that makes that assessment. But typically we go through higher priorities organizations, so L1 organizations such as CJWC, so Joint Operations Command, going down to other sort of joint operational organizations such as CANSOF, and then maybe lower down we might look at the schools and helping the schools out with wargaming, and potentially other warfare centers. So we are the Joint Warfare Center, but we've also had requests from the Air Force, from the Naval Warfare Center. So from all over, and we really just make the priority based on the urgency of the game, but also the priority of that organization and what they're doing. So really the topic is also a big component of that as well.
So once you get your warning order about a part of the CF that wants you to design a game, what are the steps? Like, what do you first do?
So that's a very interesting and fun question, because I notice that my colleagues are online spying on me right now. And the first thing that we do, obviously, is we read what the problem statement is, and we find ourselves going back to our client a lot to ensure that there's a mutual understanding of what they're trying to achieve. Because as I mentioned, that you can come up with a brilliant game. There are so many mechanics available to you in this world, a lot of games to play on, but really any sort of decision or design choice that you make has to be related to the objective. And so being able to figure out, well, what do they want? What are the outcomes and what are they trying to achieve? Allows you to identify the mechanics that are necessary. So that's the first step, is ensuring everybody's on the same page with what we're actually trying to wargame. Because my understanding might be different, particularly with acronyms and everything else. So first is ensuring that we know what we're trying to wargame. But two is a lot of the time, as I mentioned, throwing spaghetti at the wall. Well, okay, well, how best could we do this? And things that we're trying to balance are playability, the ability to adjudicate it. So what's our rule system going to look like? How can we make it simple but also accurate? How can we do it quickly? That sort of thing. And then fidelity. So it's accuracy and data capture. So we're trying to balance these three things where it's, okay, the outcomes of the game and the potential report that's going to come out of it. So we want to make sure that it's as detailed and as relevant and as accurate as possible. But the more that you try to integrate in terms of those details, the more cumbersome it becomes, influencing playability. So trying to balance that along with adjudication. And what that results into is a lot of the times us pitching different design ideas to each other, yelling at each other, saying that I'm right, you're wrong, this is better. And then coming up with a sort of merged monster of a version of all three of our ideas, because we are a 3-person team. And from there, it's through multiple play tests, usually internally with some trusted subject matter experts, and then with the clients, that we start going through a refinement process where we might redevelop certain materials or components or add or strip away different rule sets, increase fidelity of certain areas, decrease in other areas. So it's really the initial part of the design is a lot like jazz. And then after that, it becomes a lot more structured. So it's a very interesting process, to be sure.
How do you collect information from your clients without having them tell you how to design the game?
So we have a checklist, actually, which asks them what their objective is, what they're trying to achieve, what they'd like to see in the game. But we are lucky in the fact that most people are not wargame designers. And so therefore, they don't tend to have a lot of input on the game. And one of the things that we like to stress is that while everybody might have an opinion on certain wargame types or mechanics, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is the best wargame type for your particular game. And I say this because we at the Joint Warfare Center have a preference for certain game systems and game types, one of them being, as I'm sure you're familiar, the Kriegspiel, which is more of a rigid closed system with lots of rule sets and combat results tables, versus something like a matrix game, which might be more argument-based and require a lot of subject matter experts in the room and might have something like a voting mechanism instead of a detailed matrix rule sheet telling you ratios of chances of success. The thing is, though, is that really what your game is going to look like depends on what you're trying to achieve. And so you might have a preference or an idea for one. Our clients might say, oh, it would be really cool if that happened. We saw that and we saw that fight that. But we always remind our clients that really at the end of the day, whatever you're trying to achieve, whether it's writing a report and what that report's supposed to look like, we're going to build a game around that. And we're going to build a game where the results and the outcomes and the products should capture and do all that work in terms of what your measures of success were, what your objectives were, not what would be fun to play.
So can you recount if such an incident occurred where you had to have two, I guess, repellent magnets operating in the same game, like, for example, pilots and airfield engineers, not being specific, and you had to sort of maneuver them into a game. Did that ever happen?
So the military is an institution with a lot of type A personalities who tend to be very strong in their beliefs, and rightfully so, because a lot of them have years of experience. So it is definitely the job of game designers. And once we transition from game design to executing a game and facilitating a game facilitators, to be able to manage those and manage expectations. So that is, yes, incredibly important during the design phase in ensuring that people are satisfied with what has been represented to the level of fidelity of whatever their role is, but also their role within the game. And there's a lot of ways that we use that, and it's going to sound like a joke, but sometimes we use a horn. But a lot of times things like challenge cards are a really great way to enable that, particularly those don't always have to be read out loud. So definitely game design and facilitation, though, as much as the event itself is an exercise in human behavior, it's an exercise in interpersonal dynamics and how to manage the politics as you encounter in every organization as well. And so any good game designer, facilitator has to be able to tell people when they're maybe wrong or when they're overstepping in a very nice way that doesn't offend people.
No, clearly very, very difficult. May I ask you, what is I guess the bearing capacity in your experience for how long a game can be, for it to be, on the one hand, useful, on the other hand, not tiresome, on the other hand, not too complicated, on the other hand, not distracting the individuals from what they think is their job? What is the most, and of course, where you have enough time to teach? What do you think is the optimum time in your experience for most of the simulations that you design?
I think it depends on the game. I don't know if I can come up with a rule of thumb. It really depends on the complexity of the game itself, of the topic, and of what you're trying to derive from it. So are you looking to just educate some of your participants, or are you trying to come up with a 20-page report? A lot of, and I would say the majority of games that we've played have been over the course of 2 days. That's usually a factor, though, of complexity, fidelity. The number of participants will also modify that. Ideally, you want less participants, around the field of like 7 or 8, because that way you get as many things of use within the game. But then you also often, because of the way that organizations work, because the amount of stakeholders involved, we're looking at 20 to 50 participants. So that's naturally going to increase the time that it takes to play the game. The other thing to consider as well is what can you do to try to front load the game in terms of mechanics and understanding rule sets, so that you're maybe not expending as much time for players to learn the game. Because that's where a lot of the time takes during a wargame event, is players trying to understand the game, learn the game. And we find that usually the first 2 turns will take an hour each, maybe more. And from there, the time is cut in half to a third. So really it depends on how many participants, the complexity of the game, both topic and game itself, but also were the participants available to learn the game beforehand as well.
Are there any allied enablers? I know in the US, the Naval War College, their last year of schooling is 90% a giant war game that gets declassified about 15 years later. So do you have any institutional allies that either have experience or put you under high demand?
We are growing. I find that within the Western world writ large, and I'm a young wargamer, granted, but my understanding and perception, and from what I've learned while being here, is that essentially wargaming is something that goes in and out of vogue every other generation. And so right now we're finding that wargaming is increasing in its practitioners and its community right now. It's a growing force. Everybody's using it. But that wasn't the case 10 years ago. And so we have been doing a lot of that groundwork to kind of lay the amount of allies within the CAF, but to increase the spectrum of wargaming within the CAF, not just in terms of who's doing it and people using war games, but also using them correctly and appropriately, and using actual war games and not just what somebody wants to call a war game. So I would say yes, but that's been through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and it's still an ongoing process.
Yeah, I think I warned you I was going to ask you this question, and of course, be as vague as you possibly should be. But what are the competing processes in operations and intelligence? I mean, what are they doing? What are their techniques? If it's not wargaming, what do you imagine that they're doing? And how is wargaming? Well, obviously, I think it's superior to whatever the intelligence process is and operations.
So I'm naturally biased. I'm a wargamer. I believe in wargaming as a tool for many things, as I mentioned, and we teach a whole course on it. That being said, it's not the only tool, and it depends on what you're trying to achieve. There are other tools out there available to you and to CAF members that are often used and employed. One of them being alternative analysis, for instance, which is a systematic sort of brainstorming technique. Red teaming, which is similar but not wargaming at all, where it's a lot of, okay, but what if, and it's trying to challenge in a sort of table discussion rather than looking at a game that you have to play through and examine the consequences of which. There are often exercises, or I think you're going to lead into a question like this. Some people have moved to simulations, computer simulations. Those comes with their own trade-offs, obviously. But I think that for the most part, there's a broad spectrum of tools at the disposal. Every organization is using something different, and that comes more to do with, I think, personalities. That being said, wargaming is a part of the CAF OPP, so operational planning process. It is something that's taught in CAF schools. So if you take courses, wargaming should be a component of that. But doing that professionally within a standard, that's something that we hope to increase the prevalence of.
Yeah, we spoke earlier, brother, before our discussion here about the very small international community of war games. And as I'm just going to repeat what I mentioned to you earlier, which is in the 1970s, at the high point of the last or the previous hobby wave in wargaming, you only had about 5,000 American, so-called grognards, people who like to, spend days playing very complicated games. So it is a very small community. It's a very, very narrow skill set. And I was wondering if you could, I guess, re-respond to the question I asked you, which is, what have been the opportunities to associate with war game designers from other countries?
So we are very fortunate in that the wargaming community is so small that we all pretty much know each other, not just within the CAF, but also within Canada. And then we have a lot of links into our allies as well. So my colleagues on the call, for instance, work very closely with wargamers from the US Marine Corps. I have worked extensively with Professor Rex Brennan and other members of the Canadian wargaming community in academia. We have also had some links, not personally through our organization, but into France and into the UK. DSTL, for instance, is a great wargaming organization in the UK. So we do, on a very ad hoc personal level, have a lot of links, and it's just trying to formalize those because when we leave, because we invariably will, we want to be able to leave our successors with those connections. And so trying to formalize those processes it's a process in itself.
Yeah, there are 5 of us here. 3 of us played Rex Brydon's war games over the last 3 decades. So we obviously had the fortune to stumble across that education. If I could ask a question about, I guess I'm going to call it deceit, but the influence that comes from industry when they're trying to advertise or sell weapons. And so we have industrial, or rather corporate interpretations of operations research about how certain technologies function. And then you as the game designer, knowing history, having to tone it down. Have you had any of those issues or had to make a judgment on contradictory information regarding a technical capability?
I wouldn't say that we've run into that personally, because I believe that most of where we find, and I think that's the key, is we're not going to Lockheed Martin for a lot of the technical specifications. We're using our own intelligence and our own subject matter experts who have used these weapon systems and can tell us more about it than somebody who has a vested interest in saying that it's the greatest thing in the world.
No, certainly it's important because so many of the estimates, especially early war, have been wrong. I mean, I think the torpedoes in both the First and Second World Wars were famous for having that problem. If I could ask you to describe how you operationalize fear. I mean, the big problem with warfare, of course, is a lethal situation, and not to personify it, but your earlier map was a little bit traumatic because during the Cold War, my regiment built a bridge in Rankin Inlet, which is right in the middle of your map, and come spring it disappeared, and it was a very large bridge. And so, you know, of course, one of the reasons in Canada we look at logistics is because it's enormously big, and the weather is terrible. How do you model? I mean, you have multiple players, and there's always the risk that they want to be playful or fun. How do you get them to take things like fear seriously?
So I feel like that's multiple questions. There are certain mechanisms that we can integrate into the game itself, and that'll vary depending on your operational level that you're looking at. So something like strategic fear would be political will. And so integrating mechanisms in the game which inhibit or constrain certain actions because of lack of political will, representing fear. Another way, if you're looking at operational, you might be looking at morale of certain units, company level. And then similarly, at the tactical level, platoon, you might have individual participants or individuals with more fear and therefore lack of willingness to perform certain actions. So there's that element, but then there's the element that you described, which is players taking the game seriously, which is incredibly important because we don't want people coming into the game thinking that it's a game and that nothing matters. And because it's fun to play, we can treat people's lives willy-nilly. And so there are certain things that we can do to kind of create a more serious environment, despite the fact that we do want people playing and engaged. For example, when I ran Vigilant Shield, one of the components of that was search and rescue. And I printed out and had all the participants read ahead of time the 1990 crash, where several CAF members died in the Arctic performing like a mission. And so having an understanding, going into the game with an understanding that real lives are at stake is really important. Videos, that sort of thing, to kind of set the scene. Scenario building is very key. So when every game that we play will come with a sort of scenario, whether that's a game where I mentioned, you know, liberation of Mosul in 2014, or if we're conducting a defense of North America, we are going to set the scene with exactly what's going on in the world at that time. And ideally, that should be as evocative as actually playing the game, but in terms of the seriousness of the crisis, the situation, and whatever they're doing.
No, I think you probably have clients that are mature adults who understand the future implications. I'm often with undergrads left with a probably not entirely legal mechanism of if they expire in the simulation, and make them stand at the back of the class until the end of the simulation. And so far, they haven't called me out on it, but that's about all I can do, which is induce fatigue.
And I would say, so I think it's Stalin's quote, which is essentially that the death of a thousand's a number, the death of one's a tragedy. And so having, in my opinion, and this is something I integrate in my wargame practice, is that we read the news every day and we see, you know, thousands dying of famine in Yemen. You know, you start going through the numbers and you become desensitized. It's when you have people sit down and you read very personal accounts of what it's like to be a refugee, of what it's like to be a woman under Islamic law, that sort of thing, that's when people start to empathize, and that sort of compassion then becomes a factor in them playing in the game, in my opinion.
No, that's very insightful. I think, yeah, that's very insightful. I mean, I think people often forget that underneath all those pieces moving on the board are the non-combatants that are being protected, or obviously the political goals, often liberal, that the CF is aiming to do. If you permit me to keep asking questions, because I have quite a few questions, if that's okay with you. Have you ever designed or thought of implementing a solution, especially when you have resource distribution, where there's simply not enough to go around, and you don't necessarily announce it beforehand, but I guess I'm looking for a more specific question, like basically a no-win solution. But I don't want to play too much on the Star Trek Kobayashi Maru situation. But in many of the simulations, you can't have it all. There are severe trade-offs, and you have to make a choice, and it's not often clear which is the better outcome. But you can't have it all in terms of the policy outcomes. Have you ever designed that and then seen what the players do with it?
Yes. So as I mentioned in my resource management section, because managing scarcity is a problem that everybody deals with in any given organization, because we don't have as much money, we don't have as much resources as we wish we could. I can tell you in academia and business, well, if I had an extra person here, if I had extra equipment here, I could do this, and this. Well, you don't have that. And it's the same thing in the world in current affairs. With just, we have so many finite resources on the planet, and you can only do with what you have, and even then you can't actually use everything, or you don't want to use everything because we're trying to leave some for the future generations. So that's just something that everybody contends with. And we have played multiple games, as I mentioned, Force 2025, where you're playing a sort of whack-a-mole with trying to meet as much missions as you can with a limited number of forces at your disposal. So how can you creatively employ forces was what the game was about. So there's games that have been devoted to that. There's games that we played that have brought that out, where if you only have so many assets available, but multiple missions, then you have to prioritize what missions are more important to you, what falls higher on the Canadian priority list than others. So those are considerations, and those are things that are brought out in the game. But also sometimes, and it leads back to your earlier question, which was how do you contend with players potentially getting into fights? And sometimes that resource management piece will elicit temper tantrums when everybody wants to use that one asset that we have, and having to figure out who makes that call. And that's where usually our leader in the room, that's where command and control becomes very important, is that the command and control, the commander, will make that determination of who gets that one particular resource that everybody wants. So most of our games, if not all of our games, will definitely contend with the scarcity of resources, and how do you manage that?
So if I can get your reaction to one of my, I design for the classroom 60 minutes of play, and with large numbers of undergrads, and I count on about half them not reading the rules at all. If I get your reaction to what I do, is I try to create as much noise or static as possible. So I always use very complicated, very detailed hex maps, even though they're frankly irrelevant. But it causes the students to have to, well, I want them to be overwhelmed and then to try to find the trees in the forest that matter. Because I saw your maps are very clean. And of course, I'm not criticizing the maps, because you're not showing me a whole, especially if you're dealing with logistics. I'm sure there's an insane amount of complexity, even for a chess playing computer. But what do you think about this sort of the goal of creating confusion?
I think it's an admirable goal. I think you're a very cruel professor. I think it depends on your objectives. And I say this as, I'll go through a couple different points there, I suppose. I personally am a person who will never read the instructions or the rules. I just don't have the attention span. I'm a very much, I learn as I go. I'm a kinesthetic learner. And so sitting down and reading rules is very difficult to me, even though I, for all of my games, write very detailed rule sets. It's just a quality, and I don't expect my players, particularly as many of them have very, as you mentioned, they're very important people with busy day jobs that I can't expect them to read, 10, 15 pages of rules. What we aim to achieve is for them to play as they would in real life, and then we handle all of the actual game mechanics. Now, we're allowed to do that as professional wargamers more so than you would as professor. I do still try to aim to have very clear, and this is where I do like very clean maps, where I try to strip my games as much to the core as possible, because that allows you to play them quickly. Players are not bent on trying to understand the rules. They're more focused on strategy and what they're doing. And then the second, you can play them multiple times, which is, in our opinion, a wargaming best practice, where the more you can play a game, the more you get out of it. So I tend to try to go for a more simpler rule set. That being said, Vigilant Shields, for instance, that game was 5 turns over 2 days, and we factored in the play test as well, or the rehearsal, which also only got through 1 turn. So in some ways, 3 days, and we've got 5, 6 turns, because the sequence was so cumbersome, because the game was so complex. I didn't give anybody the rule sheet ahead of time. I gave a few people, knowing full well that they would not read it. Really having people to walk them through it and having player aids around is probably the best thing for it. Is that, for instance, if you'll remember, all of our units have different numbers. Having those printouts that are easily available and posted on the wall that tells you what they are and what they mean are usually very helpful. But I find that the first example turn and the first turn where you hold their hand is probably the most useful one. But if you are trying to teach your students how to sift through information and to decipher what's the most relevant and to be able to parse out what they need to focus on a given context and situation, then having a lot of weeds among your flowers of rule set is a very, it's a good game design, game facilitator technique.
Well, I can understand that as a wargame designer. I mean, compared to a technical professional, say, who's fixing aircraft, there is a single path. You are constantly having to reinvent the tax code. I mean, that's basically what a set of rules is, and it's overwhelming. Frankly, you have to reformat your brain every single time, and you might borrow pieces from here or there, but you're having to reinvent a landscape for the client every single time, and it's relentless, and it doesn't end. So I'd like to ask, because I saw that you were using computers, and I'm not sure specifically what that particular program was, but so to what extent do you have, I guess, automation and sort of distance learning components to your simulations?
So that is a good question, and I'm going to break it down with, we prefer analog because there's a lot of studies which demonstrate that you get more out of analog or physical-based games, for those unfamiliar with the term. People get more out of that interpersonal dynamic in person than they do looking at a screen by themselves. Physically moving pieces around on a map, people tend to learn more. There's studies which show that it elicits greater critical thinking skills than looking at a screen. So we try to steer away from digital games. As well as we have, though, because of the pandemic and the realities of the pandemic, we have had a lot of distributed games and games that we have not automated, but made or digitized. Most of which were not necessarily computer games, which we built, because we also don't necessarily have the time, the resources, the money, the capacity to develop that. I, as the youngest person on the team, tend to do a lot of that technological stuff, even though I probably shouldn't, because I'm more of a Luddite. What we do is we often find a way to digitize our common operating picture. So our game map and the pieces on it. We've done games where we've made, or I've made rather, organizational charts in real time while we had participants distanced around the room and displayed that digitally. We haven't gotten to the point where we are developing computer simulations. So there's the reasons for why we prefer analog. There's the resources reasons, but it also just because if you're looking at what a lot of those computer games are, as well as that they're still random number generators. So whether we're using dice, it's not so different. So the cost benefit, in our opinion, isn't always that great, because there's a lot of benefits with having facilitators in the room, which can teach you the game, which the discretion that you're able to exercise as a game facilitator, which you can't use through a computer game. So we often do closed game systems with a lot of preset rules. However, if a player comes up with an innovative idea that we didn't consider, we will modify our rules and use our discretion to come up with the results. That's a much harder thing to do in a computer game than it is to do in an analog version of that game.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think the Naval War College ripped out their computers after using them for 15 years from the 70s to the early 80s and realized people don't understand what's going on. If the mathematical process, often which is not that complicated, is hidden. And also with computer games, the actual decision rules, if they're in a program and if they're automated, for the most part, they're either very simple, or I mean, if you're looking at do I go left or do I go right? For a simple land game, those are actually mathematically indeterminate. I mean, if a computer could answer whether going left or right, then it has to have the capacity for, sort of disentangling a chess game. And humans don't operate like that. I mean, our horizons are much shorter. We don't go to the end and then come back. And so it really is not realistic. I have programmed, of course, when I meant automated, I really meant just moving the pieces on the board. But I found that you can use Vassal. It looks horribly complicated, but really it only takes a day of stress. And I've managed to sort of, in 12-hour blocks, managed to stick games in there, and it's very, very stable. But I still respect the Harpoon people, who are mostly, engineers who will play with radars in bad weather, and sort of, make conclusions about, about how technology works under difficult circumstances. So I mean, obviously, from the things that you're describing, you've experienced and had to look at topics that are way beyond a university degree. So I'm wondering, I mean, from the way that you speak it, you do sound like someone who's been designing from the 70s. So what is it that you got in your university degree that was worthwhile or sort of useful, and it's still sort of knocking around? Because of course, as a sociologist and a political scientist, you've had to have a theory about people and organizations and societies and politics. And what is something that someone could look into if they're still working in a university degree to get the skill set that you now possess?
So I think to be a good wargame designer, and the skill set that I possess, it's really about being open to the fact that you don't know a lot and that you're going to have to learn usually pretty quick. And that's the same for all of us in the wargame section. We are subject matters in certain areas, but oftentimes we have clients coming to us about topics that we're not as familiar with. So being able to do that research, so that's a university skill. The second is being able to sift through all that research and that information and figure out what's most important, and be able to think about it creatively in a way that you can model it. And to do that, you need to be able to understand a problem. So really, the skills that you're looking at are skills that isn't necessarily any particular university degree, but more the skills that you should be acquiring in university, which is comprehension and critical thinking. And it's that critical thinking that allows you to then jump to make conclusions, to abstract, to be able to represent different things. So if you, for instance, are presented with something like a space war game, you might read everything about space. You read something from Star Trek, Star Wars, but then you're doing technical readings, you're doing policy readings. But from all of that, you then have to decide and decipher, okay, well, based on the objectives of the client, what are things that would be important? So that might be, okay, well, what assets are in space? Who owns them? What do they link into? What are the characteristics of each? If we're looking at, lasers, what are the qualities and characteristics of lasers? What are the chances of success of lasers against different targets? Those sorts of things are not inherent to any university degree, but is inherent to somebody who's able to just read something, digest it, and then try to, instead of what we often do, I find in university, which is regurgitate, is find a way to stand on your 2 feet. And even if it doesn't work out, and that's kind of the key in wargame design, is that your first design probably is not what your third or fourth or your final iteration or version of the game is going to look like. And just understanding that's part of the process, is that you're just trying your best to find a way to model it. And it's only through trying and then testing it. It's a very scientific process. And then that's when you might come to something close to, but probably won't be perfect.
Well, so those are the technical skills for simulations. You of course, before you worked for the CF, you were working on simulations earlier. So were you not?
No, I come from a very, political science major. I did some humanitarian and training games simulations, more in terms of role playing, not computer simulations. I don't have any technical background. So I just want to make sure that that's clear, because if anybody comes to me and approaches me to build something computer related, I will cry because I don't have those skills. But
no, there are computer programmers. There are computer programmers that will be happily hired by us to do that. So
exactly. No, some of the work that I was fortunate enough to do through connections, just university, and this is where, if your students are curious about how someone like me, who does not have a military background, have never served in the military, and just did a political science degree in Montreal, it was about going to office hours. So I was fortunate to have Professor Rex Brynan, and I attended his master's class in Middle Eastern politics, and I was able to demonstrate my capabilities, but also I met my coworkers unknowingly, and that's part of how I was able to come to where I am, is that by attending a lot of things outside or external to university, like mega games, which I did, that's where you make the connections. And so the work previous that I did to CJWC, I had met somebody at a conference, and through that, we developed some simulations closer to Model United Nations to help Save the Children and other charity organizations in their work for training humanitarian professionals. So that was very interesting work. But
no, I definitely don't want, I don't want our viewers to think that your initial work was unimportant. For Frank Chadwick, he's done a lot of war games, no military experience, but his very first models were something called Twilight 2000, which modeled the individual soldier. And the first thing you did was you measured how long the soldier had served in combat. And if the soldier had served less than 5 years, then the soldier would have a 30-second period of time to do 6 separate actions. And with only 5 years of experience, 2 of those actions would be a moment of freezing. And he was being polite, because real soldiers have uncontrollable hiccups, shaking, a loss of bowel movement. All of those are, he was sort of doing, so you have to start at that interpersonal level. So, and then you build up from that, of course. I mean, so, obviously the simulations, especially if you're doing development work, is largely about, community engagement. Long before you deploy the aircraft carrier, obviously the people that populate it have to be spoken with. Brianna, I want to thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I mean, I had a long list of questions, but clearly you're professional because you answered them all in the process of the presentation itself. And I appreciate you laying out for my students and my viewers what the life of a professional a simulation designer is, especially where the rubber hits the road. In other words, doing it for real for the government. So Brianna, thank you very much.
Thank you. And if your students or anyone else has any questions, feel free to provide them my email.